Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Part 4. On January 9th, Dr. Lanyon, an old friend of Dr. Henry Jekyll, received a strange letter from his friend. It was quite a shock, as they hadn't exchanged letters in a long time. The letter was written in hasty, frantic handwriting, and Jekyll spoke of being in great distress, even begging Lanyon to come to his house immediately to address something extremely serious about his life. Jekyll asked Lanyon to come to his house at midnight and break into his study after the door was opened by a locksmith. Inside, Lanyon was to retrieve the upper drawer from Jekyll's medicine cabinet, which contained strange bottles and chemical powders. The letter was filled with panic, and Jekyll emphasized that his life and mental well-being were in grave danger if Lanyon did not fulfill his request at once. He also insisted that Lanyon come alone and ensure no one else was present when he arrived. Lanyon had no choice but to comply, as the words in the letter sounded so desperate that he feared Jekyll might be losing his mind. That night, Lanyon went to Jekyll's house, where a servant was waiting for him with the locksmith. After the study was unlocked, Lanyon took the drawer containing the strange chemicals, some of which were powders resembling salt, and some were bottles filled with a sweet-smelling red liquid. Returning to his own home, Lanyon began examining the contents of the drawer, though he had no idea what the substances were or what they could do. He was confused and uneasy as midnight approached, feeling that something dark and dangerous surrounded this peculiar request. At precisely 12 o'clock, a strange man appeared at Lanyon's door to ask for the drawer that Dr. Jekyll had sent. The man was suspicious-looking, carefully scanning the street as if he feared being seen. When Lanyon asked his identity, the man confirmed that he had been sent by Dr. Jekyll. Despite his unease and mounting curiosity, Lanyon invited him inside. The man entered, and Lanyon noticed his odd appearance. He was short and wore a heavy coat. But what stood out most was his face, which Lanyon described as repulsive, making him feel an unexplainable sense of tension the moment he laid eyes on him. Nonetheless, Lanyon tried to control his curiosity and act normally. But when the man impatiently asked, "Have you brought the drawer?" Lanyon felt something strange in his tone. He handed over the drawer, and the man immediately began to examine its contents, bottles and powders. The man began mixing the substances, and before Lanyon's eyes, the mixture started to bubble and produce smoke. It changed color, first to purple, then to a watery green. The man spoke in a serious tone. "Will you be wise? Will you ask me to leave? Or will you continue this challenge and discover something you never imagined?" His words were a challenge, inviting Lanyon to test something far beyond a mere chemical experiment. With great curiosity, Lanyon reluctantly asked the man to continue. The man drank from the cup he had prepared himself, and in a sudden moment he began to change shape. It was as if the transformation was happening right before Lanyon's eyes. The man began to grow, his face grotesquely altered, until he suddenly stood before Lanyon with the features of Dr. Jekyll himself, pale and trembling, like someone who had lost consciousness. It was in that moment that the visitor revealed a terrifying secret. After several moments of shock, Lanyon, still stunned, admitted that this being was Mr. Hyde, the very person responsible for the infamous crime that had rocked the city, and who was wanted by authorities everywhere. One day, Mr. Utterson received another letter from Dr. Jekyll. This letter revealed a dark secret about Jekyll's life. He began by describing his upbringing in a wealthy family and a life full of opportunities, but he had always struggled with an internal conflict. He had discovered early on that he was living a double life, appearing as a good man to everyone, while hiding a darker side of his personality. Jekyll started to explore this internal contradiction between good and evil in humans through scientific study. He concluded that every person is made up of two personalities, one good and one evil. He decided to conduct an experiment to separate these two sides within himself. He purchased chemicals and began mixing them in an attempt to create a potion that would separate his good nature from his evil one. In his quest to separate his good self from his darker side, Dr. Henry Jekyll began conducting scientific experiments. After several attempts, he discovered a way to transform himself into Edward Hyde, his evil counterpart. At first transformation, he noticed a disturbing change in his appearance. His face became ugly, but he was not bothered by it. In fact, he felt it was his true self. Over time, Jekyll began to grow concerned. What if he couldn't return to his original self? In a moment of desperation, he drank the chemical mixture again to return to his form as Dr. Jekyll. However, his experiment had opened the door to something far greater, and over time, Hyde began to take control more and more. At first, Jekyll enjoyed the power that Hyde gave him, but soon he felt that the transformation was becoming a heavy burden. Hyde started to dominate his life, isolating him from his friends and his social connections. While Hyde's life revolved around crime and debauchery, Jekyll became increasingly isolated, feeling alienated from his own self. Jekyll then took precautions, like renting a room for Hyde in a shady part of town, and making plans to ensure that Hyde wouldn't come to harm if something happened to him. Over time, Jekyll realized that Hyde had become a force beyond his control, and he could no longer stop him. Despite Jekyll's attempts to fix the damage Hyde caused, Hyde continued to destroy everything, leaving Jekyll in a bitter internal struggle. 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, Dr. Henry Jekyll woke up one strange morning after having transformed into his evil persona, Edward Hyde, during sleep. He felt something was wrong, and when he looked at his hand, he discovered it was not the hand of Dr. Jekyll, but rather the thin, grotesque hand of Hyde. He couldn't believe what was happening and rushed to the mirror to confirm his transformation into Hyde. Shocked and terrified, he wondered, how could this be? And more urgently, how could he fix it? Despite his panic, Jekyll tried to return to his original self, taking an extra dose of the potion to transform back into Dr. Jekyll. But things were no longer the same. Over time, he began to feel that Hyde was growing stronger and that he was turning into him without needing the potion. Hyde's personality started to dominate, and Jekyll found himself losing control. One day, after deciding to give up his life as Hyde, Jekyll tried to live a quiet life, away from crime, but he couldn't rid himself of the overwhelming urge to return to his darker persona. One day, as Jekyll suddenly transformed back into Hyde, he encountered Sir Danvers in the park, and a horrific event occurred. Hyde killed Danvers. Although Jekyll felt guilty, he knew it was Hyde who was responsible for the murder, not him. After the incident, Jekyll fled to an apartment in a remote neighborhood, where he began to burn his personal papers and tried to erase any evidence of his dual identity. As events escalated, Jekyll grew increasingly fearful of the idea that Hyde would continue to destroy his life. In a moment of desperation, he decided he had to rid himself of Hyde forever. But this time, he felt a terrifying thought. Could he ever rid himself of this evil side completely? When he chose to live a life of repentance, he began attending religious services and reconnecting with old friends. But deep down, he knew this peace wouldn't last. One day, while enjoying a solitary walk in the park, a sudden wave of energy overcame him, and he felt an unexpected transformation. To his horror, he found himself once again in the body of Edward Hyde. This time, it wasn't just a fleeting change. It was a deep, unrelenting fear of losing control. Jekyll realized that this was the end, and he wrote a letter to his friend Lanyon asking for help, though he knew time had run out. In his final moments, Jekyll wrote this devastating confession: "This is the true hour of my death." He realized that Hyde would take over his body completely, and that he would never be able to return to his former life. With that, Jekyll sealed his letter and hoped that, in closing the chapter on his miserable life, he would find peace at last. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications by pressing the bell button. The story is over, and see you with other stories. Thank you for watching.